Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Are Cybersecurity Concerns Putting Your Dental Practice at Risk? Presented by Rea Associates, a top 100 regional CPA and business consulting firm with offices across Ohio. My name is Imani Fields, and I will be walking you through a few housekeeping items to cover today. If you have any questions during today's presentation, you may enter them into the chat box on your screen. We will try to answer as many questions as we can at the conclusion of today's presentation. However, over time, we know that we will not be able to get to them all. Therefore, following today's webinar, we will review all questions and send out the answers via email as soon as we can. Also, if you'd like a copy of today's slides, you'll find that they're available in the handout section of the webinar dashboard on your computer screen. Today's webinar will be moderated by Alan Hill and presented by Mundy and Paul Hugenberg. At Rea, Connor works with clients to address the evolving threats to their cyberspace through risk assessment, threat assessment, and mitigation. His areas of expertise include cybersecurity, cyber forensics, and risk assessment. A principal and director of cybersecurity services, Paul Hugenberg has over 20 years of experience educating clients about the current threats and risk mitigation opportunities in the cyberspace, ensuring compliance and reliance on those controls when needed. And last, Alan Hill, principal and director of dental services, have over 20 years experience specializing in serving medical, dental, manufacturing, and professional service clients. And now I pass it over to you, Alan.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Connor, how are you?
Doing great, Alan.
Paul has to join us remotely via phone. Thank you for joining, Paul.
No problem. Thank you.
Well, here we are, and I got to tell you, 2 years ago, this was not a topic that I addressed with my client base. We knew it was out there, but does it really affect a small practice like most dental practices are? Maybe one practitioner and 6 or 7 staff. Is it that much of an issue?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and this current threat landscape and the way we've moved to this remote work and all this and the change, and cyber criminals are aware of these practices now. They're aware of a lot of these aren't up to standards in cybersecurity controls and the way they operate, and they're at huge risk for we talk about ransomware and some other things like that. And with those attacks, there's potential huge fines when it comes to HIPAA, and this could really put your practice at risk for going out of business tomorrow. So yeah, this is something that in the past it's been just kicked down the can, but now we want to bring the forefront. We want to be the leaders in this space and help people actually understand what's going on right now in cybersecurity when it comes around to dental practices.
I know, Paul, many years ago when we first met, you kind of educated me on the whole process and the risk that was there. And it's really, you're right, it's grown into something much bigger because of the way the world has gone, especially during the last year during COVID. So I know, go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say if you just kind of look around at the way small offices are built and work today, it's reliance on vendors, it's connections with vendors that are in the cloud that are kind of helping you run your office. So offices are connected outside the walls that you're physically in, and those connections are what are driving kind of the increase in the velocity and frequency of threats that we see. So when we talk about what puts a practice or any small business at risk, we're generally talking about things that come in through those connections outside the walls, like ransomware and phishing. You're not talking about Tom Cruise dropping through the ceiling, right, trying to avoid lasers. You're talking about a simple email that comes in that looks like it's real and somebody clicks on it, and 5 seconds later your computers are blue screened and someone's asking for ransom or Bitcoin to decrypt them. Well, imagine if your business can't run without those computers up just today, but with the inability to even recover those, can your business survive into next week or next month? So it's become a much more serious issue for the traditional business today. Absolutely, Al.
Usually when I talk to my clients about computers and their computer issues, it's usually the software and how they get their billings and their collection reports and production reports and their how they get everything out by production code and things like that. But you know, most of them have a guy. We all have a guy, right? Isn't it good enough just to have a guy that does that for us?
To be honest, Alan, you know, that's what we hear a lot, is that we have a guy that does this, does that. But have you taken the time as the practice to actually, you know, have maybe a third party or yourself actually take a deep dive and actually understanding what the guy's really doing for you? I think there's a lot of this is, you know, a lot of these dental owners they didn't go to school for cybersecurity. They didn't go to school for these practice management solutions they use for their dental solutions. They didn't go to school for learning how to do the QuickBooks online and all that. You know, they're really just putting all of this, they're just really giving all of this to them and saying, hey, you know, do it for me and it's working now, but are you really understanding what, you know, the risks are? And I think, you know, that day of I have a guy is the past. You need to actually understand what you're really getting into, and you need to make sure you have the right controls in place.
So you still work with your guy, but you got to make sure you have a few other things in place.
Exactly. You just got to, you know, you got to make sure that you're doing, you know, with, you know, potentially HIPAA, you need to understand, you know, the rules and regulations, and understand that, you know, they need to abide by those rules, and that will be explained later in the webinar here.
Well, we're still stuck on the first slide, so why don't you go ahead?
Awesome. So again, the agenda today, we'll do the introductions that we just did. We're going to talk about what are the real gaps that are putting your practice at risk today. Then we're going to come into the, you know, the common threats at dental practice today. We'll talk about we like to call the Rea Cyber Big Four for HIPAA compliance. I mean, it's a long checklist, but we're going to just break it down easy for you guys today. We're talking about the business associate agreement and what it is and why it's important for you and your third-party vendors. We'll have a deep dive into the current threat landscape, and then we'll do best practice and tips, and we'll do a Q&A. For any questions you guys have, we'll answer them right here on this webinar.
Slide through that slide. There you go.
There we go. So Alan, let's just start with it. What are the real gaps that put your practice at risk today? We're gonna break them down here. You know, the simple fact we talked about earlier, practice owners are more comfortable in their medical field than they are with cybersecurity and technology. You know, that again, they didn't go to school to be a cybersecurity consultant like that I am. They didn't go to school to be an accountant like you are. You know, they just, you know, that's not what they did. They're here to fix teeth and, you know, provide that certs. So, you know, when you start that outsource process, that's when there's actually some concerns, and you got to make sure that you have the right things in place that we'll talk about later. Again, second one here, you know, the third party commitments. So they're having these third parties come in and do the solutions for them. You know, I think a lot of them aren't really understanding exactly, when I've talked to them, a lot of these clients, they're not really understanding exactly what they're even paying for. And they don't really have, they can't give me a straight answer if they're really getting what they really paid for too. So that's something that's huge. And I think, you know, that's something that needs to be addressed now. Like that you can't just keep operating and keep, you know, spending this money if, you know, something happens, like a threat happens or a cybersecurity event happens and you think you're covered and you're not. That would be a really, you know, that's a tough situation to be in. The next one, I think, you know, when it comes to hardware, software providers, so that's people that do your practice management solution, that's your QuickBooks Online, that's your cybersecurity, that's your IT guy, that's your, you know, X-ray machine provider, stuff like that. You know, they're really their solutions and their MO right now is just to make sure it works, and that's about it. There's no forward thinking on cybersecurity threats on certain hardware and software. That's just not what they're here for. They're here to make sure it works, but they're not thinking that long term for you. They're not really thinking about your business and putting your business at, you know. So that's something that, again, we're seeing a lot in a lot of practices that have really outdated software and hardware from a vendor, but it's working. So I think they think they're okay, but potentially there's some, you know, with the HIPAA rule, there's some stuff that could be not compliant, and then also it could be really a cyber risk for cyber criminals to exploit. Another huge one, I think this is the biggest one. That's what we talk about every time we talk to a new client. We're talking about HIPAA and how like Rea Cyber can help is the risk assessments. Have you done one? A lot of them don't even know what you're talking about. They say, I'm not sure, or they'll say, oh, my IT guy, did it for me. But were you even involved in that situation too? That's some things that you got to, that's just a crazy thing about it too. A lot of these clients that we're talking to in dentists are, again, they haven't performed them, or they don't have the time to. And if they may have been told one has been performed, but they weren't even involved. So is that really a truly risk assessment? So something to think about. Got our first poll here. So again, that comes down to when is the last time you saw or spoke to your IT provider about cybersecurity risks?
Give everybody a minute or two to answer that. Not a minute, maybe 30 seconds or so. There you go.
There we go. Okay, so we got, with the last few weeks, 25%, last few months, 50%, and then 20%, 25% never. Okay.
Well, I wonder if that means they don't have it, or somebody just set up, they never talked to the person. So.
Yeah, you're seeing, 25%, they've never talked to about with the IT, providers. So right there, you got the 50%, and then, that's actually had a conversation, but it's actually like, what was that conversation? Stuff like that.
So I think, guys, the follow-up here as an attendee is, if you've had the risk assessment, were you actually involved in it? Did somebody sit down with you and say, this is the environment that you've spent money to run your practice on? This is the set of vendors and third-party IT guys, so to speak, that you have paid the bill for month over month and are expecting to have kind of certain things met. These are the threats and risks that you have in front of you, because you're handling patient data and you're trading those with vendors in electronic format. Did you sit down and talk about what those risks and threats are? Because in reality, your involvement as the dental practice owner is going to be the most important and significant voice in that risk conversation. What risks are you willing to accept? The ones that you aren't, what is it that you would like done with those? And how are you protecting yourselves against those when you say that this is not something I'm willing to accept? At the bottom of the paper on HIPAA is, you cannot outsource risk. So even if you have an IT guy that does it for you, or Connor sits down with you to go through the risk assessment, at the end of the day, in order for that assessment to not only be valid and useful, but compliant, you have to say yes. You have to be involved with it physically. So it's nice to see that 75% of you have gone through that recently. The question that you want to ask is, were you asked to go through that questionnaire, and did you say yes at the end? Connor?
Okay, yeah, good point there, Paul. Good point. So I think this next slide, we're talking about, the most common cyber threats for dental practices. And so these are the certain, these are certain threats that will be discussed in those assessments when you do a risk assessment. But let's go through them. Phishing attacks. So this is a huge one right now, just because, it happens for dental clients. It happens for really any organization right now. It's the idea of, you're going to have cyber criminals are going to try to send emails, for an example. We'll send an email to an organization and try to get them to click on a link, maybe give them login information, send them money. Any kind of information they can grab is really what they're trying to do. So just for an example here, for a dental practice, for an example, we could go with, there's a cyber criminals trying to get into ABC Dental. And so what they'll do is say, they want to get some information about a client, maybe a client of theirs or something like that. So what they'll do is they'll send an email saying, hey, this is a different dental practice and I'm taking over one of your patients. Can you send me over their medical records? Right there. That's a great example. So you may think, if you're the dental manager, you're like, hey, that's, they're just trying to get some They're just trying to get the information, but it may actually, you may not know who you're really giving it to. So that's an example where you can just exploit someone's information right there. Another phishing attack would be if it could be, it could be a fake QuickBooks online for accounting. It could be a fake QuickBooks online email saying, hey, you need to reset your multi-factor authentication for your account you have at QuickBooks at the dental practice, and they'll try to get you to send them your login information, and that'd be an easy way for them to get in your information and then potentially export some funds, for example. Also, another one could be if you are a dental practice and a cyber criminal will try to gain access to your login for your email or to your Office 365 account. They'll actually ask for your login and try to get you to give it to them. Could be huge. That's just for an example for phishing attacks. And the next one, ransomware, which also usually comes off of phishing, so could potentially be a bad actor or a cyber criminal will send you a file or some kind of attachment to an email, and they'll just try to get you to click on it and download it, because the dental practice will maybe download it, and once they download it, then the ransomware can kind of spread to the whole environment and then actually lock down and make it you cannot access your data or your dental management system. I think this is something huge to talk about too, because a lot of the dentists I've talked to said, oh, we don't go paper anymore. We use this, the dental management system for all of their, to work. So if you were locked out of that, a lot of dentists, they really wouldn't be able to operate. So I think that's a huge thing to talk about right there.
So Connor, just to interject here, I mean, I don't think we can put too fine a point on it or be over concerned with this ransomware bullet that you just mentioned. So when we talk about things like phishing, we all probably are aware of what those look like. You get an email in and it says, hey, your bank account's expired, log here. Hey, someone sent $50 through your PayPal, is that right? You just ordered $5,000 of tennis balls on Amazon, right? There's some view or user experience in that email that makes it look legit, and a lot of people click on those. Well, what happens after is a longer process. So you're entering in your username and password, you're entering in your multi-factor code. It's on a website that's fake. But there are steps that happen before the ultimate threat is realized, which is generally, theft of information or accessing bank accounts, things like that. Ransomware is much more urgent. So that email that if you clicked it and it took you to a bogus PayPal page doesn't necessarily do that anymore. The moment that you click it, it downloads in the background software and malicious applications that begin to affect and decrypt and often delete information on the inside. So again, we kind of go back to what you're in business to do as a dentist, and the outsourcing of all of this responsibility for HIPAA to the IT guy or to the IT shop down the street. Has that person sat down and explained to you what they've done to prevent that email from even getting into your email box? And then what happens that they've put in place if you accidentally click on that email and it gets downloaded? And what happens if that software actually starts to run? And what do you do next when there's a blue screen? And oh, by the way, what's Bitcoin and how do I pay it? Right? So you're talking about, in the ransomware bullet of these four, is literally the threat that can cease your ability to operate as a business in about 5 seconds from now, and seriously puts your ability to continue as a business, depending on the amount of money that you have to pay just to recover. There are endless use cases of organizations that have just said, I've been doing this long enough and it's too expensive to recover, I'm shutting down. There's other examples of folks that say, I just don't have the liquidity to put the money in to recover. I'm just going to stop and start over somewhere else. And those are real events, easily found in a simple Google search, where that one click on an email was performed by an organization that paid a lot of money every month to an advisor they trusted, but didn't really know what they were getting and didn't know the gaps between what they were getting and what they should be getting. So Connor, not to interrupt here, but that ransomware bullet is one that if you are running a small practice, is ultimately the biggest threat right now that you need to make sure your IT security professionals have talked to you about and are addressing right now.
Well, thanks for bringing that up, because as I look at that slide, when you think of cyber threats, at least, you know, those of us who've been around a few years, we still think hardware, software. It's the people that have in our own offices that are on the computers, and the dentist, maybe while he's back with patients, you know, we have people responsible for doing things in our own office, and are they educated and they know what to do and what not to do? These cyber criminals are really, really creative. Some of the emails that you get can look just like somebody you're used to working with.
Yeah, I mean,
No, I totally.
Sorry, Connor.
Go
I mean,
ahead,
so
Paul.
this
you're
is
good.
not something. Yeah, this is not something that is a scarlet letter either, Alan. So this happens a lot. All businesses are targeted. You know, it's generally just, hey, we know that Rea CPA has a domain name that's at reacpa.com. I'm going to run as many different types of name combinations and dictionary attacks against it and just send emails to at reacpa.com. Who's going to answer? I'm going to do the same thing to, you know, at mydentalcompany.com. Who's going to answer? These generally aren't targeted. You know, there isn't somebody likely out there that has picked Alan and said, I'm going to go hack Alan. You just get caught in this net. And unfortunately, there are so many nets and the nets are so broad that the idea of I'm going to do something 1,000 times a day, click on an email. I'm going to use that as a primary method to communicate in my business between the people that I work with and my vendors and my accountants and my bill pay folks. And I'm going to run the risk of any of those 1,000 emails that come in being something that is not valid, that immediately costs me money and time and puts my biggest asset at risk. It becomes the reason why you should have been in that risk assessment conversation, why you should have said yes, why you should understand who you're doing business with. This really is, you know, and we may be kind of, you know, beating the drum here. This really is a primary concern, and it's one that we run into all the time when we talk to small businesses. There are just steps that need to be taken that are readily available that can really mitigate or reduce this risk of ransomware to something that's negligible. But without them, it's not only likely, it's a question of when you click on the wrong one.
Thanks for emphasizing that point. It is very important.
Yeah, so I think, you know, going on to the next point here, so third-party vendors, like we're talking about, a lot of your data is leaving your organization because you're working with third parties, or a lot of these third parties have access to your IT environment at your office. So, you know, again, this is something that's, you know, can be a big concern. You know, if you have all these different vendors, that's just another way for cyber criminal to maybe, if they attack that vendor, could come back towards you. So again, this is when it comes down to it. You know, when you start to outsource a lot of your IT, for an example, you know, you're putting a lot more risk to your business. And, you know, even with your data too, where is your data being stored when it's off site, not in your location? If it's being backed up somewhere else, where's that going to be stored? Is it protected? Stuff of that nature. And also, you know, the vendors you're using for maybe like when you send out emails or email encryption, is that vendor, have you vetted that vendor? And then also we'll talk about business associate agreements. Are those in place? Because if a cyber incident happens, that helps with seeing who is liable for those fines potentially. And then the next one here is legacy hardware and software. This is one we're seeing a lot of. Is, you know, we see a lot of these offices are not upgrading to the newer versions that are actually patched and getting security updates to them. Yes, I understand it could be a financial burden, but for a lot of these risks can be mitigated that we're talking about. If you have the updated and it's getting those updates frequently. If you have say an operating system that doesn't get updates anymore, it's a humongous risk and is actually not HIPAA compliant.
Yeah, so Connor, to jump in on that, when you're talking about legacy hardware and software, right, that sounds like, you know, just just a bullet. We can handle that in budget. It's just something that, we can refresh. It's not that big a deal. Well, as Connor ended, legacy hardware and software is it's a checkbox against compliance. So if you're running, for example, and this is still pretty prevalent, say a Windows 7 desktop. So you're running a typical desktop, you've had it forever, it's running a Windows 7 operating system. That is a legacy sunset system, which means it's no longer receiving updates and security patches, and it technically makes you non-compliant with HIPAA by default. And so why would we care? Well, there's more important things happening than compliance here. An operating system that is no longer being patched and updated and supported by the vendor, in this case Microsoft, is one where the folks on the outside that are trying to figure out ways to get in know that this particular operating system is widely used and widely spread and hasn't been updated yet. And we're just going to start kind of poking and pinging and banging against networks and seeing if we can find somebody to click on an email. And one of the applets that we'll put in that email or the applications is going to test for Windows 7. Well, we know that there's a security weakness in Windows 7 and it's never going to be upgraded. So every time I hit that machine, I can take it over. So these are more than just, a couple of dollars on a new piece of hardware or running the risk of being non-compliant and is somebody going to knock on my door. The reason that these are embedded in the HIPAA standard is because they literally put the data on that box at risk, but they also are unpatchable. So you're literally running around with a door to your business that you could never put a lock on. So again, ransomware is number one on this list, but even the one that looks like it's the least important, the last bullet, is something that we see all the time, and it's something that we have to work with vendors and their IT guy on. Why did it happen? Why are they running out of compliance? And now what's the cost to improve it? And a lot of those are discussions that are surprises, and they shouldn't be. Connor?
No, I think you have a great point there. So now kind of just switching gears here. Now we're going to talk about more about HIPAA. We could spend all day talking about HIPAA compliance and talk about the checklist and talk about the certain rules, regulations. We know you guys don't have the time and day to do that. Let's just do it right now. We have 4, we call the big 4 for HIPAA compliance, that, will help you improve your maturity when it comes to HIPAA compliance. So the first one, annual business associate agreements review. This is critical. If you have to use third parties, you need to make sure you have a business associate agreement with that third-party vendor. This is the case in point to understand with the vendor who is liable if, say, a cyber incident happens, who is liable for if the information is exposed or transmitted, the EPHI data, like electronic personal healthcare information. You see who is liable at risk for that. And also it's a great way to make sure you know exactly, what kind of data they're accessing and what kind of, you understand the risk in that point too.
So Connor, as Connor, let me jump in real quick. So as you know, when you and I walk into a dental office, we have this question right up front. Do you have your business associate agreements? Can you prepare those for us? We'd like to look at them. And that's generally, the response we get from that is, hey, that's a contract. What's that got to do with, a cybersecurity HIPAA review? Well, inside that business associate agreement are the explicit line items that outline what your third-party vendor, the people that you're asking to help you run your business, are agreeing to do on your behalf in terms of security. It also denotes who's liable if there's a breach to some of that understanding. So you can easily see a clause in a business associate agreement that says, what are my duties as the covered entity, as the dentist? Well, my duties are to, perform user access controls over the system. My duties are to make sure that only employees are accessing the system. My duties are to only provide access to patient information necessary to process, a claim or, a patient form. What are the duties of the vendor? That duty of the vendor might be to ensure that all data is encrypted and backed up. That duty of the vendor may be that when there's a break in the contract, that all data is returned to the vendor. So it outlines those things. There's 2 lenses that we ask folks to look through when we're looking at those BAAs. And one is this what you thought the liability breakup was between you and your vendor? Did you realize you still hold all the liability and you signed an agreement that indemnifies the vendor if they have a breach. Usually there's a surprise there that says that's kind of not what I thought. And the second is it gives you a really good awareness that you cannot alleviate or contract away your responsibility over your patient's data. And so when you realize that, it becomes a much easier conversation to have with your third parties about what it is you're willing to expect out of them, how they're going to prove it to you, and what you expect that liability split to be. So this BAA's really, really important. One of the first steps we go over, and it's usually an eye-opener. Connor?
No, I mean, that's a great point there. And I think, again, this ties into the next of the big four is, name a security officer. So at your office, either it's going to be the dentist, it could be your dental manager, it could be, it could be one of your front desk individuals, or it can be even a third party that you trust for compliance. And this is someone who will manage, making sure they need to manage, again, the annual risk assessments. They need to be a part of those conversations. They need to also do the review of the business associate agreements with the third parties, and also be aware and actually do end user training with all staff. So that's a huge thing. Again, when it comes to HIPAA, is you have to name a security officer at your office. So that's just an examples of who it could be and kind of what they would have to do. The next one there is just, again, annual HIPAA security risk and audit assessment. So this will go through a threat assessment of what the current threats are, and also the risks that you see at your building, at your organization, and also the kind of risk you would accept. This would also include going over those business associate agreements, making sure they're still up to date and compliant. And then also it would include, using potentially a data discovery tool to make sure that, where your EPHI data is and where it's residing, to make sure that you're aware where it's at. It's a good, yearly check to see if you're HIPAA compliant or not.
So Connor,
there, Paul?
Yep. Yeah. So following up on that, usually when we talk about risk assessments in a general business sense, you're talking about folks that have expertise and experience and are driving the operational decisions for an organization. And we talk about things like, liquidity and compliance and go-to-market and strategies. You're having a conversation about how to run your business. What HIPAA has done for us is really take that risk assessment and say, there are items in here that are fine to talk about, and we call those optional. There are items in here that we think you have to do, but you can do them in a way that best suits your business. You have to do them, but you can do them in a way that best suits your business, and those are called addressable. And then there's a subset, and it is the largest set of the HIPAA risk assessment requirement, that are called required controls. These are things that are non-negotiable. You must do them. So you can think of things like enter into a BAA with your third-party vendors, use multi-factor authentication, perform an annual audit, perform an annual systems risk assessment, assign a security officer, as Connor mentioned. These are required steps outlined by sections in the HIPAA regulation. So when we talk about doing this annual security audit and risk assessment, this is more than an exercise of trying to pontificate about what risks we think that we are subject to and deciding if we want to address them or not. Many of these are required, and the exercise is the actual process you go through to document that they're in place. So it's less of a should we do it, more of a must we do it. And again, in the assessment for the HIPAA regulation, we've been granted kind of the the favorable writing of the act that lets us know what we have to do instead of just kind of guessing and putting something down on paper working with a consultant. This is a pretty prescribed exercise that needs to be done every year. Connor?
Exactly. Great point again. I think we go down to the next one here. So this is when it comes to that security officer we talked about before. So, you need to have an information technology policy in place. So this policy will explain to your users, so your other dentists, your front desk individuals, your hygienists, stuff like that. It's just they understand the risks of what you guys are working with when it comes to the EPHI data, and also what they can do and they can't do on the computers. And then also if they do see something that doesn't look correct, that they must report it to the dentist or the security officer. This is huge. This helps also bring that culture of cybersecurity to your office, so they actually understand, oh, we're taking this serious. This is a serious matter. That helps a lot in this situation. We've seen a lot of clients, putting in a certain policy in place really shows great value. And I think another part that's huge here is end user training is a must. Like we can all day talk about, the risk assessments that are required to do and all that, but at the end of the day, you want to build that culture around at your dental practice that, hey, we're taking this serious, and we want it from the top down. We want to make sure that everybody understands the risks and that cybersecurity has to our business. So having end user training is huge. You can talk about the certain cybersecurity threat landscape. You can go into HIPAA and talk about EPHI and talk about what you can do and what you can't do with client data and stuff like that. I mean, end user training is, you can never get too much of that, for sure.
Hey guys, I got a question. Well, why don't we go ahead and do this poll question first? Go ahead.
Oh, here we go. So yeah, this question: have you performed a HIPAA risk assessment this past year?
With everything else going on the past year, I'm going to ask about a HIPAA risk assessment too. All the other things we had to do to open our practices back up in May. There's a reason for it.
That's a crazy time to live in.
Oh.
Oof.
Well, let me before you kind of comment on this, let me ask both of you a question.
Okay.
Okay. There's things I'm supposed to do. What's my exposure? I mean, from being HIPAA compliant, I mean, is there a professional risk? Is there a financial risk? What is it?
So let me start, Connor, and then you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I apologize. So being remote, there's a little bit of a breach that I'm talking into. Let me talk about maybe the organizational level risks, and then Connor, I know you have a lot of information on the fines and things like that. So what's the risk of a dental office not performing their HIPAA risk assessment or not, addressing HIPAA compliance as a primary driver? Well, first, we are definitely moving very quickly into a world where the consumer is quite knowledgeable on their rights as an individual, their assumption of privacy, the sovereignty of their identity. And they are trusting organizations when they give this information that puts them at risk for things like identity theft, for things like just personal health information they don't want out. They're trusting their partners to keep this information secure, to control this information so that it doesn't get out and again, kind of put them in that risk of identity loss or financial loss or just privacy loss. That's kind of the overall consumer view of what is occurring. And so, you see a lot of folks now saying, hey, we had a breach, here's 12 months of credit reporting, we're sorry it happened, we didn't mean to do it, and nothing else occurred. Well, the problem is that it did occur. We're sorry we broke into your house, and we're sorry your stuff was stolen, and here's an insurance payment. Well, the problem is I can't replace my identity, right? Once my identity is taken, it's very hard for me to get through this exercise. And in healthcare, there's an explicit privacy matter associated with that as well. You're not just talking about my name. Now you're talking about things that are part of my body, part of who I am. And I don't think that I want those things out. The second problem becomes when something happens, it becomes an inevitable report, either automatically or through a patient up to the OCR. And the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, will publish in a publicly available website those dental offices and practices, well, medical offices in general, who has been breached and why they were breached and how many records they lost. And you say, I'm a one-person shop, I'm not going to be on that list. Most of the people on that list are one-person shops. right? So it becomes a publicly available information that then gets picked up by the local news, and now you have a reputation risk in place just for ignoring some of the practices that we just kind of all generally expect to be in place, today. So those are conversations that can get really involved and deep when we sit and we talk to a practice owner. A lot of times, Alan, we're talking to somebody, the practice is their asset. That is the largest asset they have. It is the driver of their income, it's the driver of their wealth, and it is also something that at some point they want to transition or exit, right? There's the practice has to move on after them. Well, these types of omissions put all of that at risk. It puts the value of the asset at risk. It puts its transition value at risk. It actually puts the practice at risk, depending on how difficult a breach may be. And that's just a breach, right? That's not talking about things like phishing or a bad employee who takes something or a backup that doesn't get recovered. That's talking about an actual breach. Breaches themselves are what we hear about the most, but they're also the least frequent event. Most of the time, this lack of attention to HIPAA provides an internal problem, not one that's seen by the public or the newspaper or the patient. It's the data backup that doesn't get recovered and I lost my QuickBooks. It's the data tape that my IT guy said was stored encrypted and we can't find it, and I don't have any of my patient records for the last 12 months. I don't know what they did. I don't know what services I performed on them. I don't have any of that historical data. And so you can think of the mess that brings just internally and the cost to try to recreate that. So those are just kind of organizational risks. Connor, do you want to talk about maybe the fines and what happens if this stuff actually gets reported upstream?
Sure. So I think it's in a later slide here, but we can just kind of go over it now. So it looks like right now with OCR, 9 out of 10 complaints that are issued to the OCR, they get looked at, they get investigated. And, a really interesting thing too, is you look at it. So right now, the fines vary, just, depending on what, how many data records were exposed, from 10,000 over to 50,000. And that's with if you fess up within 30 days and you're working with the OCR. Say you don't work with the OCR and you just say, hey, I'm just going to try to work through this. Maybe we won't really talk about the next 30 days. That fine will be around 50,000 or more. And I think a big thing too, when they ask you, the OCR comes in and investigate you, they're like, hey, their first question is, hey, have you performed the risk assessment for this current year? Because that's what they're going to go off. They're going to base what you already knew as your acceptable risk and risk you didn't know about, and to kind of get where they need to pay, like where that fine's going to be, where that threshold of the fine's going to be. So I think that's something that, again, should just be an eye-opening statement. Is like, hey, they're going to ask for the risk assessment if you have an issue, and if you don't have it, this fine could have been 10,000. Now we're looking at 30,000. I mean, it's crazy to really think about. And again, when you hit home about that public eye, if you're on that HIPAA OCR wall of shame, it's not a good look for your business in the area. There's a lot of dental practice in every city, so you're really just, there's a lot of competition out there, and if you're known as exporting or exposing people's dental records, they're not going to come back to get their cleaning every year. They're going to go to someone else.
Well, one last thing to add to that is the performance of a risk assessment, the assignment of a security officer. These are in the annual security audit. These are what are called minimum standards that are commercially reasonable, which means if there's an event and there is a response, that response is going to take at least one of two things. It's going to take a regulatory or oversight response. That's the OCR responding to a complaint or notification of a breach. And immediately the questions of, have you done what you're supposed to do? Are these things in place? Get asked. In the event that these things are in place, the likelihood of you suffering from a civil suit by the folks that have lost their identity goes way down. The probability of that goes way down. In the event that you have a risk assessment performed that is done by a nationally and internationally recognized framework like NIST, and we are a NIST organization, so when we do assessments, we use the NIST framework to perform the high trust assessment. If you use a framework in the state of Ohio, you fall under what's called safe harbor. And safe harbor actually drives the potential for you to be sued civilly by patients down to almost zero. In other words, if you do what you're supposed to do, then it prevents you from suffering heightened damages in the event that there's just a business accident. Yes, we had a problem. Yes, we'll fix it. I get it. There may be a small fine, but we did everything we were supposed to do. In the event that you ignore that, the liability exposure goes way up, because even the Attorney General for the state of Ohio is going to come in and say, you didn't even do basic minimum practices, and we're going to allow people to sue you on behalf of their identity. So the liability here grows when you ignore just the minimum basic requirements. Connor?
No, another great point there. I totally agree. All right. So the business associate agreement, and why it is what it is and why it's important. We've been talking about it the whole time here. So I mean, again, it's the agreement between a covered entity, so the dental practice, and then a third party who is working with EPHI data. And then this outlines, who's responsible for data, if it's exposed or exploited, and then also, who is liable if a breach occurs for the data. Next slide here. Again, these are, we just talked about the fines. So you're looking at, 10,000, 50,000 if it's corrected within 30 days. If it's neglected after 30 days, you're looking at, $50,000 potentially in fines. And over, the OCR will look at about 9 to 10 compliance complaints. We'll look at them, and then the first questions I'll ask is if you performed a risk assessment in the last 12 months, and also if you performed a security risk assessment in the last 12 months. Good there. Okay, so these are some of those tips we talked about earlier. So some of these steps that you can take for your practice today, and I think you should have a discussion with your IT vendor. These are big IT ones here. So first one, endpoint protection. So this is like your antivirus. When you buy a computer at home, you get potentially McAfee or whatever, you bought it from Best Buy. You got to make sure you have a commercial grade endpoint protection. So this will help the traffic in your and also the computer to make sure that if something's downloaded, it gets blocked or not allowed to be downloaded is a good example. Buy it, install it, needs to happen. Or make sure if you think you have it, you're paying for it, make sure you ask your IT provider, who are using for endpoint protection. The next one, email encryption is important. So if you are sending client data in and out of your organization, you're receiving maybe that basic information with their medical history on it, you got to make sure you're accepting it encrypted. This is a very huge thing when it comes to HIPAA compliance. You need to use encryption when it comes to email. So you cannot use the free emails anymore. It's a thing of the past. You got to buy an encryption service. You can get that usually through your IT provider, or there's a ton of third parties out there that will help you with that issue. Next one, time to remove that old computer and the old software, like we talked about earlier. It's not compliant anymore, and it's a huge risk to your business. You need to remove them and work with your IT provider, and they usually have solutions on how to upgrade you from. Currently, we're seeing a lot of that Windows 7, and now it's Windows 10, and all those practice management solutions are able to get you to Windows 10 too when it comes to software. So it's got to be done. Next one, data backups. You have them. I hope you do, and you make sure they're encrypted. And also, they have they're off-site, so you can have someone in your office take home the backup of all your data, and then also you can also do now is called like a hybrid, which you have a cloud backup that you got to make sure is encrypted. Most IT providers will have this option, so you just have to explore pricing and stuff like that. But this is very important to have backups of your data, because if you do have an issue and you can't get into your data in your office, you need to have a way to get back and be able to work. Because again, like we talked about earlier, a lot of these practices don't have paper. It's not a paper operation anymore. It's all digital. So we got to make sure we can still operate if there's an issue. Written information security plan. So this is something like we talked about earlier, having a policy in place. This is something you want everybody in your office to read and to understand the risks of, the kind of data that you guys work with every day. And this helps to try to bring that culture of cybersecurity to the office. And so they actually understand that you're taking this very seriously, because it is serious. The next one, having an independent HIPAA risk assessment. So this will have, say Rea Associates or a different firm can come in and we'll perform the risk assessment with you. We'll walk through it step by step, talk about the risks, talk about your BAAs, do a walkthrough, look at your hardware, look at your software, look at what kind of data is on these computers, and just to give you this kind of sense of, and this is maybe your first time doing it too, so it's a good training for you to understand, what a HIPAA risk assessment is and what it takes and how to do it every year. And then so some free resources for listening today. We can do a dental practice data analysis. So this is a interview-based conversation, and we'll kind of be able to map out where your data is currently, your EPHI, and then also kind of map out your third-party vendors and see kind of, where your data is, where's it going. And this is a really good conversation to have, just to, put a pen on paper, just to have, a good assessment to see, where is all my data going? Where is it? You may just have all these vendors and you really didn't realize, oh, this is really going here. Wow. It's crazy. So another one is, a cybersecurity self-assessment survey. So this is like kind of a gap analysis compared to standards. We can just do a quick and easy, kind of see where you're at now, see where the gaps are, and we can help you try to, fix some of those issues, and also potentially work with your IT provider. And we even do a risk assessment off this gap assessment. This just kind of gives you that baseline of like, oh, okay, there is some things I need to fix.
I do have a question coming in, and I think I know who it's coming from, because it's coming from the West Coast. Thanks for getting up this morning. Thank you very much. And I love the way he writes too, so I'm going to try to get this out smoother. When it comes to I'm trying to get his words right. When it comes to ransomware, or if you're a victim of ransomware, or someone takes over your computer, help me out. What do I do, is what he's saying. Does he pay the ransom? Does he not pay it? Are there ways not to pay it? We'll work on his writing skills later, but basically what he's saying is, if I get a ransom payment comes up, and they're holding my computer hostage and all my information, is there another way around this, or should I just pay it?
So, Connor, let me take a jump at this first, and then you can fill in. This is a tough question, and there is no right answer. So I'm sorry that I can't tell you black and white what to do. The way that ransomware works today is a criminal has taken over your computer, has lied to your employee, and has installed software that he shouldn't have, and has encrypted your files and said, if you pay me, I'm such a trustworthy person that I'll give you the key back to unencrypt everything that I just stole from you because I'm such an honest person. So that's a circular argument that never has a good ending. So what happens when these things occur is, the first thing that we ask you to do is ensure that your PCs are disconnected from the wall. So if you start to see a blue screen happen on your administrator's console, you want to remove that from the network, so that the virus, which is built to spread to connected computers, doesn't have an opportunity to do that. The second thing that you're going to want to do is contact your attorney and your IT professional. And the reason that you want to do that is because the response is going to take a little bit of input in terms of your compliance or regulatory structure. Some people like to enjoy the privacy of the attorney-client privilege relationship and wish the attorney to drive all of the decision making. So whatever happens stays within inside the business. That's up to you. We talk to customers about if that's a viable option for them when we build their plans. But let's assume you don't have an attorney, you call the IT vendor. That assumption is you have an IT vendor that you can call, right? And so if you're on the phone right now and you don't know the number of the IT vendor to call because your computer was just encrypted with ransomware, you need to answer that question immediately. What's going to happen is there are different types of ransomware, just like there are different types of flus. And each different ransomware variant has, at times, vaccines or publicly available countermeasures that we can run and decrypt the information ourselves. Some of them we know it works. I got this ransomware variant. I know I can apply this tool to it, and it has a 95% success rate of decrypting all of the information back to where it was. I suggest you don't pay the ransom. There are variants that are new that have about a 3% success rate. In other words, what they recover is minimal at best and oftentimes not even valuable because it's so disconnected. And now you have a secondary decision to make. How much was the ransom request? Did they want 1 Bitcoin? Today, that's about $50,000. How much would it take you to call your IT provider and say, can we rebuild this computer? And the answer you may get is, it'll cost me about $3,000 to build the computer. It's going to take about 2 days worth of work, to restore the database, which we tested is good. I'm going to send you a bill for $10,000. You're going to pay the $10,000 instead of the 50, right? There are situations where you have to make this decision. We have a current customer right now who has a demand for 5 Bitcoin, so $250,000, to decrypt their ransomware event. The particular variant that they got is one that has the 3% success rate. So we're not going to pay the ransom. What we're doing is evaluating the cost it takes to rebuild the system now, and comparing that to the 250, just to do an ROI in your head. So I know that's a little bit longer of an answer than you wanted out in California, but there's a stepped stage to it. What type of ransomware did you get? How much do they want? Can we fix it? If not, how much can we get back with the vaccines that are available? If not, can we recover from backups and at what expense? The worst case scenario that you run into is you have to rebuild from scratch, and that is often more expensive than any of the other options.
Thanks for trying to answer that. And in fact, I think you did answer that question, Paul. Thank you. We'll just work on his writing skills later. And that brings us up to the end of the hour. I want to thank both of you for bringing your expertise out to the Rea dental community today. And thank everybody else for joining us. There are phone numbers and contact information there on that slide. And of course, you can simply Google Rea Associates and find us, either Paul, Connor, or myself online through Google. So there's lots of ways to get in touch with us, and we look forward to talking to you. And most importantly, we thank you for joining us today. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Alan, and thank you guys for joining us. For all your cybersecurity concerns putting your dental practice at risk, we hope the team was able to provide you with some valuable insight in regards to best practices and potential solutions. If you sign off today and realize you have additional questions, like Alan mentioned, you're always welcome to reach out to any of them directly with the contact information. And thanks, and we hope you guys have a wonderful day.